The World Cup has a habit of breaking things. Sometimes it breaks managers, sometimes it breaks plans, sometimes it breaks entire federations, but every now and then it does something worse. It takes the biggest moment of a player's life, the night a country has waited decades for, and it turns it into a stretcher, a silence, and a sound that nobody in the stadium can forget, because that's what happened to Canada. In the middle of what should have been one of the greatest nights in the history of Canadian soccer, with the crowd celebrating, the goals piling up, and the World Cup suddenly feeling real, one challenge changed the entire mood of the country. One tackle, one twist, one snap, and just like that, the celebration was over. Not officially. The match kept going. The score line kept moving, but the night was gone. The innocence of it, the joy of it, gone. And what makes it worse is that this was supposed to be the moment everything finally came together. Canada had spent years trying to drag itself out of the margins, years of false starts, embarrassing exits, near misses, and that familiar feeling that the country could produce hockey stars by the dozen, but still couldn't quite build a football nation. 40 years had passed since their last World Cup appearance. 40. An entire generation had grown up without seeing Canada belong on that stage. So when qualification finally arrived, it didn't just feel like a sporting achievement, it felt like a correction, like history had finally moved. And then came Vancouver, a full house, a country watching, a team playing with the kind of freedom that only comes when belief finally catches up with talent. Canada weren't just winning, they were tearing the game apart. They were 6-0 up. Every attack felt dangerous. Every touch felt sharp. Every run felt like proof that this wasn't some fluke qualification story. This was a team arriving. This was the kind of night fans replay for years. The kind of night that turns players into symbols. And right in the middle of it was Ismaël Koné, not just another name in the midfield, not just another promising player. Koné was one of those footballers who made everything look like it was happening half a second slower for him than for everyone else. Calm under pressure, strong on the ball, impossible to ignore once you actually watched him. He carried that strange combination every coach loves and every opponent hates. Technique and edge, composure and chaos. He could settle a match or crack it open, and on that night with Canada flying, he looked exactly like what the country wanted him to become. The future of the team and maybe one of the faces of the World Cup itself. Then the challenge came in. It wasn't one of those dramatic cinematic moments where the camera catches every angle perfectly. It was worse than that. It was real, messy, sudden. Canada were pushing forward. Koné moved to receive the ball. There was pressure, contact, a collision that, in real time, looked bad enough to stop the crowd, but not bad enough to prepare them for what came next. Then came the reaction. The way Koné went down. The way players immediately turned away. The way teammates called for help before the replay had even loaded in anyone's mind. And then the sound. People who were there described the same thing. A pop, a snap, something sickening enough that a packed stadium full of screaming supporters suddenly went quiet. Not disappointed quiet. Not nervous quiet, shocked quiet, the kind of silence that spreads because thousands of people realize the same thing at once. This isn't a cramp, this isn't a knock, this isn't something he's running off in 2 minutes. Something has gone very, very wrong. You could see it on Koné's face before anyone said a word. The confusion first, then the pain, then that horrible realization athletes get in the exact moment they understand their body has done something it was never supposed to do. And that's the cruelest part of football at this level. Careers don't always collapse in slow motion. Sometimes they collapse in one movement, one planted foot, one awkward angle, one tackle that arrives half a second too late. The medics came on, players stood around helplessly. Canada's bench looked stunned. The crowd, which had spent the night celebrating a historic result, was now watching one of its most important players being treated in silence. That emotional whiplash is hard to explain unless you've seen it happen. One minute you're celebrating the future, the next you're watching it being carried away. But Koné still managed to do something that made the whole thing hit even harder. As he was taken off on the stretcher, he gave a thumbs up. It was such a small gesture, barely anything, but it changed the entire image of the moment, because now this wasn't just a player in pain. It was a player trying to comfort everyone else while he was the one being taken away. Trying to tell the crowd he was okay when he almost certainly knew he wasn't. Trying to reassure teammates whose faces were telling a completely different story. That's when the cameras started catching the reactions around him, and those reactions told the real story. Teammates looked shattered, not annoyed, not frustrated, shattered. You could see players fighting tears. You could see the way the energy drained out of them. Coaches on the sideline stopped looking like tacticians and started looking like people trying to process something awful in public. It's one thing to lose a player. It's another to watch a friend's dream potentially disappear in front of you, because this wasn't just any tournament cycle. This was supposed to be Koné's World Cup runway, and if you didn't know his story before that night, the injury made people learn it very quickly. Koné's path was not some neat academy fairy tale where everything opened at the right time. He was born in Ivory Coast, moved to Canada, built his life in Montreal, and developed in a football culture that still doesn't have the same infrastructure or certainty as the major European nations. He didn't come from one of the giant systems where elite players are manufactured every year. He came from a place where every step matters more because there are fewer guarantees, fewer shortcuts, fewer safety nets. He broke through in Montreal. He showed enough quality to convince people that this wasn't just a nice local story. Europe came calling. Suddenly the arc was obvious. Canada had found another piece, another player who could carry them into a new era, another symbol of what the national team was becoming: fast, fearless, modern, dangerous. And that's why the injury didn't feel like one player getting hurt. It felt like a threat to the entire momentum of the project, because international football is brutal like that. Nations spend years building toward one tournament, one cycle, one moment when everything aligns. Then a key player goes down and suddenly the whole thing changes. The shape changes, the confidence changes, the plan changes, the emotional balance changes. Even if the team keeps winning, the mood changes. And Canada didn't just lose a midfielder that night, they lost certainty. That's when the conversation started to turn ugly. Was it just bad luck? Was it a reckless challenge? Was it one of those awful football moments where nobody really meant to cause serious damage, but the consequences were catastrophic anyway? The player involved was clearly affected. There were apologies. There was visible remorse. And that matters, because intent matters. Football is a contact sport. Not every bad injury has a villain. Sometimes two players go for the same ball and fate does the rest. That is the strongest defense of what happened. And to be fair, it's not a weak one. But here's the problem. Even when there is no obvious villain, the damage still exists. The image still exists. The fear still exists. Canada still had to walk off that pitch knowing their World Cup preparation had just been ripped apart in front of them. Their fans still had to celebrate a 6-0 win while wondering if one of the team's most important players had just lost the tournament. And Koné still had to face the possibility that the biggest opportunity of his career had disappeared in an instant. That's why the aftermath felt so uncomfortable, because no one really knew how to behave. Do you keep celebrating the result? Do you mourn the injury? Do you praise the performance? Do you condemn the challenge? Do you move on because football moves on? Or do you stop and admit that the entire night now belongs to one terrible moment? Canada tried to do both, and that split is exactly what made the whole thing feel so haunting. On paper, it was a historic win. In memory, it became something else. A celebration with a scar through the middle of it. A statement performance attached forever to a stretcher image. A World Cup qualifier that should have lived as a breakthrough, but instead became a reminder of how quickly this sport can turn on the people inside it. And that's where the story gets bigger than Koné, because this wasn't happening in a vacuum. The World Cup does this all the time. It magnifies everything. Pressure, expectation, pride, panic, politics, injury, blame. It turns qualification campaigns into national tests. It turns players into symbols. It turns every setback into a referendum on the entire project. A coach gets sacked and it becomes a national crisis. A player gets injured and suddenly people are asking what it means for the future of the sport in that country. That's the machinery of the tournament. It doesn't just reward, it consumes. And Canada know that better than most, because they aren't one of the old powers. They don't have the luxury of endless depth or the emotional numbness that comes from qualifying all the time. For countries like Canada, every breakthrough feels fragile, because it is fragile. Every star matters more. Every injury cuts deeper. Every lost month of development can alter the trajectory of a generation. That's why the Koné moment hit so hard. It exposed the vulnerability beneath the optimism. Canada had spent so much time talking about growth, about golden generations, about finally finally belonging, and all of that was true. But this was the reminder that progress in football is never clean. You can build for years and still watch one moment put the whole thing at risk. You can do almost everything right and still end up staring at the one thing you couldn't control. And the reaction from inside the camp only reinforced that. The language around Koné after the match wasn't cold or tactical. It was emotional, protective. You could hear the concern in the way teammates spoke about him. You could hear the anger and sadness mixed together. Not necessarily anger at one person, but anger at the randomness of it. Anger at football itself. Anger at the timing. Because if this happens in a random club game in the middle of a long season, it's bad. If it happens right before the biggest tournament your country has chased for decades, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes cruel. And once that feeling takes hold, every official response starts sounding incomplete. The updates come out, assessments, scans, recovery timelines, careful wording. Everyone tries to avoid the worst case language at first because football always does that. Nobody wants to say too much too early. Nobody wants to confirm a disaster before they absolutely have to. So there's this weird limbo after a major injury where the silence almost becomes part of the trauma. Fans refresh for news. Journalists start reading body language. Coaches answer questions without really answering them. And every hour without clarity somehow makes the situation feel heavier. Because uncertainty can be worse than bad news. Bad news at least gives you something to grieve. Uncertainty keeps the door open just enough to hurt more. Could he recover in time? Was the damage season ending, tournament ending, career altering? Was Canada about to lose one of its core players for the most important stretch in modern national team history? Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but those were the questions hanging over everything. Not just over Koné, but over the entire team. And that's where trust starts to break down in football. Not because people assume bad intentions, but because the machine keeps moving while the human being inside it is still lying on the floor. The tournament doesn't pause. The campaign doesn't stop. The federation still has to plan. The coaches still have to adjust. The pundits still have to debate replacements. The social media clips keep rolling. The highlight packages still call it a famous win. Everything keeps going. And somewhere inside that momentum is a player whose body has just betrayed him on the biggest night of his career. That disconnect is hard to watch once you notice it. It's why fans get cynical. It's why players talk about feeling like assets instead of people. It's why moments like this linger long after the score is forgotten. Because the sport asks everyone to move on before they're ready. Before the player is ready. Before the teammates are ready. Before the crowd is ready. The system doesn't have time for grief. It has fixtures, deadlines, qualification windows, tournament prep. So Canada did what teams always do. They tried to turn the pain into motivation. Play for him, win for him, carry him with you. It's one of football's oldest emotional survival tricks, and sometimes it works because it has to. When you can't fix the situation, you give it meaning. You tell yourself the injury has to stand for something, that the suffering can be converted into focus, that if the team goes to the World Cup and does something special, a piece of that belongs to the player who was taken away from the journey. But even that idea is quietly devastating, because listen to what it actually means. It means the team has already accepted that one of its own may not get to live the moment he helped create. It means the dream has to continue without one of the people who built it. It means the celebration becomes a tribute before the tournament has even started. And that's the part people struggle with, not the tactical implications, not whether Canada can replace his ball carrying or his composure or his energy. The real wound is that football can be so unfair so quickly that a player can help drag a nation to the edge of history and then be denied the chance to stand in the middle of it. That's what made Koné feel like another World Cup victim. Not because the tournament physically injured him itself. Obviously it didn't, but because everything around the World Cup raised the stakes until one injury stopped feeling like an injury and started feeling like a theft. The tournament made the moment sacred. It made the dream bigger. It made the consequences unbearable. And when something went wrong, it didn't just hurt a player. It wounded the story of an entire team. And that is why this still matters beyond one match in Vancouver. Because when people talk about the rise of Canadian soccer, they usually talk about the bright stuff. The crowds, the goals, the belief, the idea that the country has finally arrived. But underneath that optimism is a harder truth. Arrival does not protect you. Momentum does not protect you. Talent does not protect you. In football, the closer you get to the thing you've been chasing, the more there is to lose. That's the trade. The dream gets bigger, and so does the damage when something breaks. Koné's injury forced Canada to confront that in the middle of its own celebration. It took a night that should have felt simple and made it complicated dominated forever. It reminded fans that these players are not symbols first. They are people first, bodies first, lives first, careers built over years that can be altered in 1 second while everybody else is still singing in the stands. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of the whole story. The scoreline survives. The result survives. The history books will still show the win. They will still show the statement. They will still show Canada marching toward the World Cup, but they won't show the silence properly. They won't show the look on his teammates' faces. They won't show the fear of a player realizing what might have just happened to him. They won't show the stretcher leaving the pitch while a country tries to figure out whether it's allowed to celebrate anymore. That part lives somewhere else, in memory, in footage people re-watch with dread, in the way fans now flinch whenever a player stays down too long in a World Cup cycle, in the understanding that for all the glory this tournament promises, it always seems to demand something back. And that's why the World Cup keeps taking victims, not always in the obvious way. Not always with scandal or failure or public humiliation. Sometimes it does it by taking the purest night a nation has and poisoning it with one moment, one sound, one injury, one reminder that football doesn't care how long you waited or how much a player sacrificed to get there. It can still take him anyway, and Canada found that out on the very night it thought everything was finally going right.